So it's the high costs that we're seeing that everybody's being affected by. But what that is showing are the breaks in our social safety net. These are long-term systemic issues that we haven't taken the time to fix, and now we're seeing more people spilling into the food banks. So we need to make sure the best way to bring down food insecurity is to make sure people have the incomes they need to go to the grocery store and get food for themselves and their families.
What is that like when the demand is so high and there's simply not enough supply to meet all of those needs?
I can't tell you how stressful it is. I'm here today at North York Harvest Food Bank in the Greater Toronto area, but I've been speaking to food bankers across the country, and they are telling me they're heads down, working long hours and just trying their best. And, I've said this over the summer, this is the toughest time in our history, in our 41-year history in this country, but I know that food banks are tougher. We have been supported by generous communities. We'll keep at it. We'll make sure there's food on those shelves, sorted and out into the communities, healthy food. But what we need is to see government action. We need to see the number of people relying on food banks in this country come down. And unfortunately, it's only headed in the wrong direction right now.
So when you say government action, what specifically action does the government need to take right now in order to reduce the number of people, as you say, who are coming to use food bank services?
So it's really about building our social safety net that we've neglected for decades. So talking about a minimum income floor. We don't talk enough about single adults. Single adults, those living alone, don't have a second income to buffer their, a job loss or low wages. Represent almost half of the people who rely on food banks, and yet they're completely neglected by government policy. We tend to focus on people like seniors, on children, but not single adults. We need some policy focus there. We also need to support people with disabilities. There is not a single province in this country that provides adequate support to people with disabilities, and that needs to change. And we also need to look at the affordability side of the equation as well. So rent, most of the people who use food banks are renters. And when you're spending, anything above 30% is considered a crisis, but people are spending, 60, 70, 80% of their income on rent. So we need supports now. We need long-term plans for affordable housing, but we need rent assist so that people can pay their rent now, so they don't have to make those impossible choices. No one should have to decide, am I going to pay my rent this month, or am I going to buy food for my kids? That's not a choice anyone in this country should have to make.
And to that point, with the current economic climate, wondering what you've seen in terms of not the shifting of the demographics, but the expanding of demographics that are using food banks now. Part of the number here, the report said around 500,000 food bank clients, about 1/3 are children. That's one piece, but you said also a lot of working adults.
Yeah, so these are people who are working, and no one who is working at a job should have to go to a food bank, and yet we don't have the supports that we need for folks to make sure that their incomes are enough to pay for all the necessities of life. And the other thing I want to mention that we're seeing, and I've heard this from Vancouver all the way to St. John, are the number of new clients. So people who are having to make that call. I was on the call center at Winnipeg Harvest or Manitoba Harvest this summer and heard a mom who just said, I don't want to have to be making this call. I really wish I was in a different position. It's not an easy thing to turn to your food bank for support. So it's people who've never thought they would be in this position. That's who we're seeing a lot of at the food bank right now.
Part of the challenge, of course, that we've been reading about here is the fact that because everyone is tightening their belt, given the inflation, that perhaps people are feeling less generous too, because they in fact need more for themselves during these economic times. So I'm wondering, what bridges the gap then? For example, we've seen grocery chains record record profits as well. At how much is that contributing to food bank supply? Are we getting a lot from grocery stores? Is that part of perhaps how to close the gap there?
So we've always been very generously supported by the grocery sector. What we're seeing now is that food banks are having to purchase more food than ever before. So I say that, with the rising cost of food, we've got more people coming to the food bank. We've got fewer people in a position to give, and food banks themselves are purchasing food. And so their dollars are having to, it's a stress on their dollars as well. So what we're asking is, if you are in a position to give, that you do contact your local food bank and figure out how you can support them. We really need the help of every Canadian, but we also need pressure on governments. We need every Canadian to lend their voice to this cause. I believe we can have a hunger-free future, but it's going to take this social policy investment so that we see a future where everyone in this country can afford to put food on their table.